Good morning. Good morning, students. I want to make a video to present this PowerPoint to you. I feel like there's explanation I want to give on top of the slides. I don't think the slides will be as effective if you don't hear me talk over them. So 7.3 is about methods of war, different strategies governments are using to conduct World War I. We already talked about the use of propaganda on the home front to try to rally citizens' participation on the home front, to participate and support the war in a variety of ways. We also looked at how propaganda was also used to strike fear in civilians of the enemy. Today, what I want to talk to you guys about is the actual methods of fighting that are used. World War I is characterized as a stalemate. I'll talk about that in a moment. So this PowerPoint is specifically about the Western Front in France. World War I is fought in a variety of theaters. It's fought in East Africa, it's fought in North Africa, in the Middle East, it's fought in parts of the Pacific. But the Western Front is most famous because this is where the majority of the people die in the war. So this is about offensive strategies. I want you to think about what you know of sports. You can play offensively or defensively, but when you're playing offensively, you are trying to take territory, okay? So in World War I, obviously people are trying to make gains in terms of taking territory. Germany is trying to get to the capital city of France to conquer it. Well, this becomes a stalemate. I'll talk about that in just a moment, but I want you to kind of see here where the Western Front is in World War I on this map. So it's over here in France. There is an Eastern Front when Russia's in the war. Russia drops out in 1917, but for a long time there is a big Western Front that's being fought over here. A big Eastern Front. The Western Front here, though, you can see that it actually doesn't move much throughout the war. This is the furthest the German army is able to get. They never reach Paris. Really, the front line doesn't move more than a few miles in either direction in 4 years. So that's why it's called a stalemate, okay? A stalemate is when neither side is winning. It's when you're kind of locked, and it's basically a draw or a tie. Okay, so what we find is these are industrialized powers that are fighting one another, and they start developing all these new tactics and technologies to try to break the stalemate, but they're adopted by each side. So you have a relatively equally matched fight, if you will, okay, in terms of weapons. So the war starts actually with Germany attacking. And they attack through neutral Belgium as part of their Schlieffen plan that they've developed for several years. Remember, Germany is very concerned about trying to prevent a two-front war. They don't want to be fighting enemies on both sides. So they think it's going to take Russia time to mobilize and get to the Eastern Front. So they think they can really quickly loop in and attack France and defeat them in 6 weeks. A very ambitious plan. Belgium was technically neutral when war is declared between these powers. So Germany was seen as very, very aggressive for marching through Belgium. This is what they expected Germany to do. They expected them to go through the actual border that they had with France, where France has a lot of heavy defenses. But they surprised France by going through the Ardennes forest and going through neutral Belgium. Again, seen as very aggressive, and it's one of the reasons that Britain joins the war right away, because they really think that this is a very aggressive thing for Germany to do. So you can see in terms of these kind of flanks or lines of men that are fighting, there's one group that really has a long way to march, okay? A long way to march, okay, to loop around Paris and secure it. And this ends up having some problems, okay? So there's a question about this. What's the Schlieffen plan, and what are some problems related to it? Why doesn't it work? Well, the Schlieffen plan is the German plan to try to prevent a two-front war by quickly defeating France. It does not work. Part of the reason why is that Russian railways had improved and their organization within Russia had improved. So they were able to get to the Eastern Front 2 weeks earlier than the Germans had anticipated. Also, German railways only went so far into enemy territory. And at a certain point, they're not really able to keep up with the men marching. And so you have this issue of being able to deliver supplies, okay, and reinforce your troops. Also, the Schlieffen Plan did not anticipate resistance from Belgium or plan for British forces to assist Belgium. So when they march through Belgium, Belgium actually starts fighting and resisting, and the German army doesn't really expect them to do that. Britain also sends in soldiers. So they get locked down in some fighting here in Belgium that they don't anticipate, and it prevents them, again, from fulfilling their 6-week timeline. Lastly, it didn't take into account French aerial reconnaissance. So there were French planes that were actually watching what the German army was doing on the ground. And they also just underestimated the impact of modern weaponry, that it would be a little bit more difficult to make gains when your enemy has machine guns that can fire 500 rounds a minute, okay? So let me go to the next slide. Why is this not working? Okay. So a little bit more about this, okay, and a little bit more about why the Schlieffen Plan fails. The British Expeditionary Force had 150,000 men delay the German advance at the Battle of Mons. Again, this is in Belgium. So by the end of August, German troops were 135 kilometers from their nearest railhead, again, creating resupply problems. These are more specific facts to support these general points, okay? General von Kluck from the German army, he's on the right wing, that long right wing that I showed you, and he struggled to keep up with the 30 to 40 kilometer march per day. So they can't really, again, if we could go back and look at this map of the Schlieffen Plan, this flank is struggling to march 30 to 40 kilometers a day. That's a whole lot. And then finally, their advance is halted from September 6th through the 9th, and they dig down along the Marne River. Basically, both sides meet one another. The German army is not able to advance any further. And then, so to protect themselves, again, from like machine guns and like this heavy weaponry, they dig down into trenches after a series of outflanking attempts. This is known as the race to the sea. I'm going to show you this. Oh God, I usually illustrate this on the whiteboard. But basically, when you're trying to outflank, I don't know, you guys should be able to see my cursor. If you have a line, okay, the idea is you can't break through. So when you're trying to outflank, you try to run and get behind the enemy, okay? Well, you have both sides doing that, trying to run and get behind the enemy, try to run and get behind the enemy, and then they end up trying to outflank each other so far they run into the sea here, and then they run into the mountains here, okay? And then there's no more attempts to outflank or try to get around the enemy, so the only option is to dig down into these trenches. Okay, so the space between enemy trenches is horrible. It's filled with barbed wire and shells that are buried in the ground, landmines, etc. This is very dangerous. But basically, what you have is men trying to charge through no man's land, the space between the enemy trenches, to seize the enemy trenches. The problem is you have machine gunners dug down there, ready to fire. So people just get mowed down in huge amounts. Here are some pictures of the trenches. It was absolutely terrible to live and sleep and fight in these things. People were wet sometimes 24 hours a day. Men developed trench foot. There were lice and rats, and they couldn't bury the bodies fast enough. A lot of problems, okay? So we know that this stalemate has developed. There's these different tactics and pieces of technology that are used to try to break the stalemate, to try to break through the line and make an advance in terms of territory. So the first thing that they try is preliminary artillery bombardment, and that's basically shelling. Okay, so we're going to shell the enemy trenches using these cannons really, really, really heavily to try to kill as many people in the trenches as we can, and then we'll send over a wave of infantry or men. Okay. So the purpose again is yeah, to try to kill as many people in the enemy trenches as possible, so it's easier for your men to charge and take the trench. The problem is when you start preliminary artillery bombardment, a lot of people you're giving the enemy advance notice that you're coming. Okay, gave advance warning that an offensive is about to begin. The other problem was that the shells that they were using in World War I were terribly inaccurate. They a lot of times didn't even hit the enemy trenches. There was also a high proportion of dud shells that didn't explode at all. The enemy trenches, particularly the German trenches, were pretty good, and they were strongly reinforced with concrete. So they would shell the enemy trenches and think that they got the machine gunners when in fact they did not. And then the barbed wire that surrounded enemy trenches was not cut by the shells. So it was still difficult to get through the barbed wire. So they improve upon the preliminary artillery bombardment strategy with something known as the creeping barrage. Okay, so this is a synchronized shelling while your troops are advancing. Okay, so this is an illustration that's showing that. We see our troops advancing forward, and this is like synchronized, okay, for the bombs to hit in front of them as they're advancing. So you can see that this is an improvement upon the last tactic, but the problem is that it was difficult to synchronize. Once your men left the trenches, there's no way to tell them to slow down or speed up because they didn't have like radio pieces in their ears like they do today. There was also, again, a lot of inaccurate shelling. So sometimes there would be instances of friendly fire where they would kill their own men. So sometimes the troops could advance too rapidly or too slowly to be effectively covered. Okay. So that's the creeping barrage. I'm trying to go fast to make this video not too long. Here are mines. This is another strategy in World War I. Both land mines and sea mines are used. The Allies do create a pretty effective naval blockade of Germany in the First World War. That will not happen in the Second World War. I'll talk about that later. Mines are important because, yeah, you don't know where they are. The enemy steps on them and they blow up, right? So they're often laid under enemy trenches, and the goal, again, is to breach the line. A lot of times they were digging really far down, actually, and like underneath no man's land to place these landmines. So digging these tunnels was super hazardous. And of course, there's a lot of detonation inaccuracies. And once you have a lot of landmines out there in no man's land, anyone can step on them. All right, this is the next really big technological development. You should be listing these in your notes. The tank. Okay, the tank arrives on the scene, I want to say in 1916, first by the British, and then Germany will develop them. At first, they're really, really slow, like 4 miles per hour. Like we can walk faster than that, guys. That's really slow. So you can see the advantage here is that men actually have cover from machine gun fire. They're in this metal cage, and you can't be shot. The problem is these would get stuck in the mud really easy. They go really slow, so it gives the enemy a lot of time to think about what they're going to do to take that tank out. And at first, they have limited production. It's actually not until really late in the war, the last month or two, that we see any substantial gains made by tanks. But yeah, I was right. First used in the Battle of the Somme in 1916. And those are some weaknesses you can see there. Another development that was particularly terrible was the development of chemical gases or chemical warfare. Chemical warfare will be outlawed like based on the international rules of war after World War I. Okay, so people are not supposed to use this, yet it does happen. There's 2 types of gas. It was first used actually by the Germans, and then it's developed by the other side, by the Allies. There's tear, chlorine, and mustard gas. The problem with gassing your enemy out of the trenches is that the wind could carry it the other way. So sometimes when you would throw, gas shells at enemy trenches, it would just blow back in your face. Chlorine gas was water soluble, so people figured out how to get around chlorine gas. It's mustard gas that was particularly terrible. That was the one that really basically eats away at all of your mucous membranes. Very, very painful death. But you can imagine that chemical warfare is very, very scary. To be on a battlefield and then all of a sudden be blind is a very, very terrifying, terrifying thing. They do develop masks in response to chemical warfare, but at first they leak and not everybody has them, and it takes a while to combat that. Okay, so how can we characterize the Western Front of World War I? This is trench warfare. This is total war. This is a war of attrition. And that means it's a war of body count. Because it's a stalemate and because no ground is being won, how do you know who's winning? That's when you start counting bodies. And that's what the Vietnam War, by the way, became. How do you know who's winning when you're not seizing strategic territories? You start just killing as many on the other side and thinking eventually they'll give in. So this becomes a war of attrition. This is when all strategy breaks down. You don't want this to happen in a war, okay? You don't want a war of attrition. That means that there is no strategy, okay? So that's not a good thing. And of course, it's a stalemate. It's a stalemate. It's more or less a draw until the end. It's also a mechanized war, the first war where we see really, really like industrialized weapons. Okay, so I would like for you guys to talk. I didn't talk about the war in the sea or the air. Usually I do that in a different lesson. What I'd like you to do today, I'm just talking about land tactics, okay? I want you to watch this video, Shell Shock, and I want you to take 15 film facts. Right down here in your notes, okay? So watching this video should have helped you answer these questions. All right, thanks, guys.